On a humid November afternoon in 1853, the air in Brazos County, Texas, was thick with the scent of roasting meat and the sound of white laughter inside the grand, white-pillared mansion of the Sterling estate. The master, Silas Sterling, was raising a crystal glass to toast his empire, 5,000 acres of cotton, hundreds of souls under his boot. To the neighbors sitting at his mahogany table, Silas was a king, but while they toasted to their prosperity, a shadow moved in the kitchen. Her name was Hagar. She was 34 years old, a mother whose heart had been turned into a sharpening stone as she stood over the massive silver platter carrying the centerpiece turkey. Her hands didn't shake. She reached into the folds of her apron and pulled out a small, unassuming vial of white powder. It was odorless, it was tasteless, and in a matter of hours, it would turn this house of celebration into a house of screaming ghosts. But you see, Hagar wasn't just looking to kill, she was looking to erase a legacy. The poison she sprinkled over the skin of that bird was merely the opening act of a campaign of terror that would eventually clear every plantation owner for 20 miles around, leaving the land to the very people they had tried to break. Most people think revenge is a sudden explosion. Hagar knew better. Revenge is a slow burner, cold meal served over months until the enemy is begging for the mercy of the grave. The guests didn't notice the way Hagar watched them from the kitchen doorway. They didn't see the cold, dead light in her eyes as Silas Sterling took the first bite. They were too busy admiring the perfectly tamed woman who served them. They had forgotten what Silas had done 7 months earlier. They had forgotten the morning of April 15th when Silas decided that Hagar's spirit needed to be crushed in the most public way possible. He didn't take her to the fields, he didn't take her to the whipping post, he took her to the barn. And he forced her 3 children, Jedediah, 12, Martha, 9, and little Beth, only 6, to stand in the straw and watch what happened in that barn. Wasn't just a crime against a woman. It was an attempt to murder a mother's soul in front of her legacy. Silas Sterling thought he had broken her that day. He thought that by shaming her before her children, he had ensured her silence forever. He was wrong. He didn't break her. He turned her into a silent, patient reaper, and as the first guest at the table began to clutch their stomach, Hagar felt the first spark of a fire that would burn the entire county to the ground. As the sun began to dip below the Texas horizon, the laughter inside the Sterling mansion didn't just stop, it curdled. It started with the governor's nephew, a man who had spent the morning bragging about the sturdy stock he'd recently purchased. He dropped his fork, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the silver on the table. Then came the gasps. Silas Sterling, the man who considered himself a god among men, felt a sudden, searing heat in his gut that no wine could cool. Hagar stood in the shadows of the dining hall, as motionless as the marble statues Silas had imported from Europe. She watched the chaos unfold with a terrifying serenity. This was the harvest of the seeds he had planted in the barn, for every tear her children had shed in that straw. A guest now wept in agony for every scream Silas had stifled. A man now shrieked as the poison began its work on his nervous system. By midnight, the grand dining room had become a tomb. 9 men, the most powerful landowners in Brazos County, lay scattered across the expensive Persian rugs. The feast of prosperity had turned into the supper of dust, but Hagar knew this was the easy part. Killing a man is a moment. Breaking a system is a season. She looked at Silas, who was still clinging to life, his eyes bulging as he looked at the woman he thought he had tamed. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "The children are sleeping, Silas," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry corn husks. "They didn't have to watch this." "But I did. I watched every second." She didn't finish him off. That wasn't the plan. She needed him to survive just long enough to see the world he built start to rot from the inside out while the mansion descended into a frantic panic of doctors and dying gasps. Hagar slipped out into the night. She didn't head for the woods to run. She headed for the slave quarters. She didn't go to find her children. She had already moved them to a hidden spot in the creek bed days ago. She went to find the old ones, the men and women who knew the secrets of the Texas soil. She needed more than just white powder for what was coming next. She needed the whispering winds. She needed the omens. She knew that the white families in the surrounding plantations would Hear of the poisoning and come with fire and hounds. They would expect a simple slave revolt. They would expect blood in the fields. What they wouldn't expect was a ghost story that moved faster than their horses as the first light of Friday morning touched the cotton fields. The news of the Sterling massacre began to spread, but the story that reached the neighboring estates wasn't just about poison. It was about the woman in white, who had been seen standing on the roof of the mansion as the men died, her hair turning into smoke. Hagar had begun the second phase of her revenge, the psychological erasure of the masters by noon. The first of the neighboring planters arrived at the Sterling gate, but they stopped dead in their tracks. Hanging from the gate wasn't a body, it was Silas Sterling's own golden pocket watch, ticking loudly, and every hand on the watch was moving backward. The ticking of that gold pocket watch echoed in the sudden silence of the driveway to the planters gathered at the gate. It was an impossible sight. Time was the one thing they controlled. They dictated the hours of labor, the seasons of harvest, and the lifespan of their property. But here, in the heart of the Sterling estate, time had rebelled. The backward spinning hands were a message. The world you built is being unmade. Tear it down. One planter shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to mask as anger. But as he reached for the watch, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the solace of his boots. It wasn't the sound of drums, it was the sound of 100 heavy stones being struck against the earth in perfect unison. Hagar watched them from the high grass of the perimeter. She had taught the workers that the greatest weapon wasn't a knife, it was the unknown under her direction. The men who had once spent 14 hours a day picking cotton were now soldiers of the shadows. They weren't hiding. They were haunting inside the mansion. Silas Sterling lay paralyzed, trapped in his own body. The doctors were baffled. The poison hadn't killed him, but it had stripped him of his speech and his movement. He was a prisoner in his own skin, forced to watch through the window as his empire began to dissolve every night. Hagar would enter his room. She wouldn't strike him. She would simply sit by his bed and read to him from his own ledger, counting not the bales of cotton, but the names of the families he had torn apart. Tonight, Silas, she whispered, we count the tears of my Sarah. Do you remember how you laughed when she cried in the barn? I remember, and so does the wind outside. The psychological campaign intensified. The surrounding planters began to experience the great unraveling. It started with small things, horses found with their manes braided into intricate, impossible knots, wells that tasted of salt despite being miles from the sea. Then came the white cries at midnight. A sound would rise from the woods, a high, mournful wailing that sounded exactly like the voices of the 9 men who had died at the Thanksgiving table. The white farmers began to lose their grip. They doubled the guards, but the guards found their rifles replaced with corn stalks while they blinked. Fear is a parasite. Once it enters the mind, it feeds on everything else. Rumors flew that the Sterling estate was no longer a plantation, but a portal to something darker. It's the woman. The neighbors whispered over their barricaded doors. The one Silas tried to tame. She didn't die, she became the land itself. Hagar knew that the physical walls of slavery were built on the belief that the master was invulnerable by making them look like terrified children in the face of the supernatural. She was melting the chains. She was creating a 20-mile dead zone of terror where no white man dared to ride alone. But she knew the law wouldn't stay away forever. The Texas Rangers were being summoned as the sun set on the 7th day. The first ranger arrived at the edge of the county. He found a sign nailed to a dead oak tree. It wasn't written in ink, but in the charred remains of the Sterling family Bible, and it said, "The law of man ends where the mother's grief begins." The Texas Ranger, a man named Captain Graves with a face carved from granite, stared at the charred Bible pages. He had hunted outlaws across the Rio Grande and stared down lynch mobs. But the air here felt different. It was heavy, like the atmosphere before a cyclone, and it tasted of copper. He pulled his revolver, not because he saw an enemy, but because the silence was so absolute. It felt aggressive. Graves rode toward the Sterling mansion, expecting to find a scene of bloody rebellion. He expected to see smoke, fire, and the chaos of an uprising. Instead, he found a nightmare of order. The cotton fields were perfectly manicured, the rows straight as arrows, but there wasn't a single soul in sight. No workers, no overseers, No sound of life, only the wind whistling through the bowls. When he reached the mansion, the doors were wide open. He stepped into the foyer and stopped. The grand hallway was lined with mirrors, and on every single one a word had been etched into the glass using diamond rings: Mother Sterling. Graves called out, his spurs echoing like gunshots on the hardwood. He found Silas Sterling in the library. The master of the house was sitting in his high-backed chair, his eyes wide and fixed on a spot on the wall. He was alive, but his hair had turned snow white. In a matter of days he was covered in a fine layer of gray ash, and around his neck was a necklace made of small clay figures. 3 children and a woman. Hagar didn't hide from the ranger. She walked into the library carrying a tray of tea, her expression as calm as a Sunday morning. She looked at Graves, and for the first time in his career, the captain felt the urge to back away. "You're the law," Hagar said, placing the tea down. "But the law didn't come when the barn door was locked 7 months ago. The law didn't hear the children screaming, so the law has no seat at this table. You've poisoned these men." "Woman," Graves growled, his hand tightening on his holster. "I've come to take you to the gallows." "Then take me," Hagar replied, stepping closer until the barrel of his gun was inches from her heart. "But know this, I am the only thing keeping the whispering winds from crossing the county line. If my heart stops, the fever that took the 9 men at the table will become a plague that takes every house from here to the Brazos River. You can hang a woman, Captain, but you can't hang a curse." Outside, the sky began to turn an unnatural bruised purple. A low hum started to vibrate the floorboards, the sound of the workers in the woods, humming a tune that felt like a funeral march for the world. Graves knew the captain looked at Silas, who let out a single pathetic whimper, a tear tracking through the ash on his face. Graves realized then that this wasn't a crime scene, it was a transformation. Hagar had turned the Sterling estate into a fortress of the mind. She had weaponized the white man's own superstitions and guilt against them. The ranger looked back at Hagar and saw a power that no bullet could touch. As Graves turned to leave, intending to call for reinforcements, he found his horse standing at the front steps. Its mane had been shorn off, and in its place someone had woven a crown of thorns and wild Texas roses. Captain Graves didn't ride back to the station. He couldn't. Every time he tried to steer his horse toward the county line, the animal would scream and rear, refusing to cross an invisible boundary. It was as if a wall had been built out of thin air, a psychological border that Hagar had patrolled with nothing but the sheer force of her will. The ranger was trapped in a kingdom where the currency was no longer gold, but memory. Back at the mansion, Hagar began the 3rd stage of her campaign. The erasure. She knew that as long as the neighboring planters held onto their land, they would eventually find the courage to band together and strike. She had to make the land itself reject them. She gathered the women from the quarters, the mothers who had seen their own children sold like livestock. The masters believe they own the soil because they bought it with paper, Hagar told them, her voice echoing in the hollowed-out ballroom. "But we have watered this dirt with our blood for 3 generations. The soil knows our names. It does not know theirs. Tonight, we tell the earth to spit them out." That night, a phenomenon began that would later be whispered about in Texas folklore as the Bleeding Harvest. On the 3 largest plantations surrounding the Sterling estate, the white families woke up to find their porches covered in a thick, red sap that smelled of iron and old sorrow. It wasn't blood, but it looked so much like it that the realization didn't matter. The terror was the same in the quarters of the neighboring estates. The enslaved people didn't revolt with fire, they revolted with silence. When the masters screamed for water, they were met with blank stares. When the overseers cracked the whip, the workers didn't flinch. They simply turned their backs and began to hum Hagar's funeral march. It was a total strike of the spirit. The machinery of the South relied on the fear of the enslaved. Hagar had replaced that fear with something the masters feared more: a total lack of recognition. By the end of the 2nd week of December, the first neighbor, a man named Miller, who had been a close friend of Silas, broke. He was found wandering his own fields at dawn, shivering, claiming that the cotton bolls were whispering the names of his ancestors' sins. He packed his family into a wagon and fled, leaving behind 1,000 acres of prime land and a house full of furniture. He didn't even stop to lock the doors one by one. The dominoes of the Brazos began to fall. The psychological pressure was a tightening noose. Hagar's messengers, young boys who moved through the woods like shadows, would leave a single, charred corn husk on the pillow of every master. Who refused to leave it was the mark of the mother. It was the warning that the poison of the Thanksgiving table was still looking for a home inside the Sterling mansion. Hagar walked into the nursery where her children were now playing openly. Little Beth was sitting on the fine silk rugs, playing with a doll made of Silas Sterling's own expensive cravats. Jedediah was looking out the window, no longer a boy who expected a blow, but a prince surveying a realm. Is the law coming back, Mama? Beth asked, her eyes wide. The law is lost in the woods. Baby, Hagar said, stroking her hair, and the masters are running for the hills. This land is starting to remember who really loves it. But the victory was interrupted by a sound that shook the windows, the heavy rhythmic thud of a steam engine. The governor, hearing of the madness of Brazos, had sent a military train armored with iron plates, and it was heading straight for the Sterling gates. The train screamed as it tore through the morning fog, a black iron beast puffing thick, soot-filled smoke into the pristine Texas sky. This wasn't a passenger car, it was a mobile fortress, bristling with the barrels of state-commissioned rifles. The governor, terrified that Hagar's spirit strike would spread across the entire South and dismantle the economy of the lash, had sent the military to restore order. They didn't come with mirrors or whispers. They came with the cold, hard logic of lead and steam. The soldiers, led by a Colonel Blackwood, a man who believed everything could be solved with a firing squad, poured out of the cars before the train had even fully stopped. They marched toward the Sterling gates, their boots rhythmic and heavy. They expected a battle. They expected to find a fortress of rebellious men armed with stolen muskets. Instead, they found the gates wide open again. There was no one to shoot. The mansion was silent. The fields were still. But as Blackwood stepped onto the property, he noticed something that made him pause. Every single tree on the long drive to the house, hundreds of oaks, had been draped in white funeral shrouds. They looked like a line of ghosts standing at attention, watching the soldiers march by. Search every inch. Blackwood roared, "Find the woman, find the ringleaders." The soldiers tore through the mansion. They smashed the mirrors Hagar had etched. They threw the expensive furniture from the balconies, but the house was empty. Silas Sterling was gone. Hagar was gone. The children were gone. It was as if the entire population of the estate had simply dissolved into the mist of the Brazos River that night. The soldiers camped on the lawn. They felt safe in their numbers, protected by their modern rifles. But as the fire burned low, the humming began. It didn't come from one direction. It came from the ground beneath their feet, a low, vibrating frequency that made the water in their tin cups ripple one by one. The soldiers began to hallucinate. It wasn't the poison from the turkey, it was the fever of the shrouds. Hagar had spent weeks gathering a specific type of river mold, a fungus that, when dried and burned in the campfires, created a potent, waking nightmare. By midnight, the camp was in a state of terror. Men were firing their rifles at the shrouded trees, convinced the ghosts were closing, and Colonel Blackwood tried to maintain order. But he found his own tent filled with thousands of monarch butterflies, their wings beating a sound that whispered, "Leave, leave, leave." Hagar watched from the hidden tunnels beneath the household passages used to move goods that she had reclaimed for her people. She held Beth's hand in the dark. "Do you hear them, Mama?" Beth whispered, "The soldiers are crying. They're learning, Beth." Hagar said, "They're learning that you can't occupy a heart that doesn't belong to you." The next morning, the invincible military train prepared to depart, not because they were defeated by a bullet, but because 30% of the men refused to leave the armored cars, claiming they had seen their own mothers weeping in the cotton fields. Blackwood, his face pale and his hands shaking, ordered a retreat as the train began to pull away. The soldiers looked at the rear of the mansion. Standing on the very top of the roof was Hagar, holding a single red flag, but as the wind caught it, they realized it wasn't a flag at all. It was the blood-stained shirt Silas Sterling had worn in the barn 7 months ago. The iron serpent retreated, its whistle sounding like a wounded animal as it fled back toward the civilization of the East. Colonel Blackwood's report would later speak of uncontrollable atmospheric fevers and mass hysteria, but the truth was written in the wide, hollow eyes of his men. They hadn't been defeated by an army. They had been evicted by a haunting with the military gone. A strange and heavy peace settled over the 20-mile radius around the Sterling estate. The madness of Brazos had created a vacuum no white farmer would dare return to the abandoned plantations. No tax collector would ride down the shrouded drives. The area became a blind spot on the map of Texas, a place where the law of the state simply ceased to exist. Hagar emerged from the tunnels. Not as a fugitive, but as the architect of a new world. She didn't call herself a queen, but to the hundreds of souls who had slipped away from neighboring counties to join her, she was something more. She was the mother of the unbound. They began to build. They didn't build grand mansions or monuments to vanity. They built a community hidden in plain sight. They used the materials of their former masters to create a life of their own. Choosing the Sterling mansion was no longer a home for a tyrant. It became a school, a hospital, and a storehouse. The world thinks we are ghosts, Hagar told the gathered people in the ballroom, where the broken glass of the mirrors still lay like diamonds on the floor. Let them. A ghost cannot be whipped, a ghost cannot be sold. We will live in the shadows of their fear until the shadows become the light. For 6 months, this territory of freedom thrived. They grew their own food, not for the market, but for the table. They sang their songs, not to mask their pain, but to celebrate their presence. Jedediah, now 13, spent his days patrolling the borders. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a whistle and a bag of the river mold. He had learned that the mind was a much more effective cage than any iron bar, but Hagar knew that a territory of freedom, inside a state of bondage, was a ticking clock. The masters who had fled were gathering in the capital, their pockets empty and their hearts full of a cold, vengeful greed. They were lobbying for a full-scale invasion, not a train this time, but a scorched earth campaign. They wanted their land back, even if they had to burn every blade of grass to get it. Hagar sat in the library. Looking at the map of Texas, she saw the lines of the law closing in. She knew she couldn't fight a war of attrition. She had to finish what she started. She had to make sure that even if they took the land, they would never ever want to live on it again. One evening, a rider appeared at the gate. He wasn't a soldier or a master. He was a black man, covered in the dust of a long journey, carrying a message from the north. He looked at Hagar and whispered, "The underground has heard of the mother. They want to know, are you ready to move the mountain?" The messenger's name was Obadiah, a man who had navigated the stars from Mississippi to the Ohio River and back again. He stood in the Sterling library, his presence a reminder that while Hagar had built a kingdom of shadows, a much larger war was brewing across the horizon. "The mountain isn't just the land, Hagar," Obadiah whispered, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "The mountain is the memory of what happened here. If you stay, they will bury you in it. If you move, you become a legend that can never be killed." The plan was audacious. Hagar knew the scorched earth campaign was coming. She knew the masters were coming back with torches, intending to burn the ghosts out of the Brazos. She decided she wouldn't wait for them to start the fire. She would give them exactly what they expected, but on her own terms. "We are leaving," Hagar announced to the hundreds who had found sanctuary under her wing. "But we are not leaving this place empty. We are leaving it full of their own sins for the next week." The Sterling estate became a hive of strange activity. They didn't pack gold or silver. They gathered every ledger, every whip, every chain, and every auction block from the surrounding 20 miles. They dragged these instruments of agony into the grand ballroom of the Sterling mansion. They piled them high until the mahogany table, where the 9 men had died, was buried under a mountain of iron and ink. Hagar then led the people to the river. "The water is the path," she told them under the cover of a moonless night. The hundreds of ghosts began a silent exodus. They moved through the swamps and the thickets, guided by Obadiah and the stars. They weren't just fleeing. They were being relocated to a series of safe houses and hidden communities that the Underground Railroad had meticulously prepared. But Hagar stayed behind. She stood alone in the foyer of the mansion, holding a single torch. She looked at the walls, where she had etched the word mother. She looked at the stairs where Beth had played, and finally, she looked at the barn in the distance, the place where Silas Sterling thought he had destroyed Hirsch, heard the sound of the approaching militia, It wasn't the rhythmic march of soldiers this time. It was the chaotic, hateful rumble of a mob, hundreds of white farmers, fueled by whiskey and the desire to reclaim their property, were screaming as they rode up the drive. They carried torches of their own, ready to reclaim the land by fire. Hagar didn't wait for them to reach the porch. She walked to the center of the ballroom, to the mountain of chains and ledgers, and she dropped her torch. The dry paper of the ledgers caught instantly. The grease from the kitchen and the old wood of the mansion acted as an accelerant as the first of the militia burst through the front doors. They didn't find a woman to capture. They found a literal hell on earth. The air was filled with the sound of iron chains glowing white-hot and the smell of burning ink, and there, standing in the center of the inferno, was the silhouette of a woman who looked as though she were made of the flames themselves. The militia scrambled back in terror as the roof of the Sterling mansion began to groan, but as the structure collapsed, they heard a sound that chilled them. More than the heat scorched them, the sound of Hagar's laughter, echoing not from inside the house, but from the woods behind them. The Sterling mansion didn't just burn. It vanished. The heat was so intense that the white pillars crumbled into ash, and the mountain of chains melted into a distorted, blackened heap of iron to the militia standing on the lawn. It was a terrifying sight. They had come to reclaim their property, but they found themselves standing in a graveyard of their own history. The ledgers, the only proof of their ownership, were now smoke rising into the Texas night, but the real terror was the laughter. It didn't come from the fire, it came from the darkness of the trees. 1,000 voices joining Hagar in a final, mocking chorus. The ghosts weren't in the house. They were already gone, vanishing into the secret veins of the Underground Railroad, heading toward a north that would soon be a battlefield. Hagar emerged from the tree line miles away. Her children beside her. She looked back one last time at the orange glow on the horizon. The Sterling name was gone. The 20-mile radius was no longer a plantation district. It was a scar on the map for decades after. That land would remain fallow. Local legends say that no cotton would ever grow there again, that the soil, having tasted the bleeding harvest, refused to serve a master ever again. Silas Sterling was never found. Some say he wandered into the Brazos River, his mind shattered by the white-haired silence Hagar had gifted him. Others say he lived out his days as a beggar in a distant city, jumping at the sound of a ticking watch or the smell of roasted turkey. Hagar and her children reached the free states just as the winds of the Civil War began to howl. She didn't change her name, she didn't hide. She became a legendary figure among the abolitionists, known only as the Mother of Texas. She spent the rest of her life ensuring that the stories of the barn and the Thanksgiving table were never forgotten, not as tales of victimhood, but as blueprints for resistance. The story of Hagar teaches us that the greatest power of an oppressor is the belief that they own the truth by shattering their mirrors, poisoning their arrogance, and weaponizing their own fear. One mother didn't just save her children. She liberated a territory. She proved that while you can chain a body, you can never cage a mother's grief once it turns into a mother's justice. Today, if you visit that corner of Brazos County, you won't find a mansion. You'll find a forest so thick and silent that even the birds seem to whisper. And if you listen closely to the wind moving through the oaks, you might still hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of stones against the earth, a reminder that some debts are paid in blood, but the greatest ones are paid in the silence of those who finally walked away.